Welcome back, friends. I'm joined by Professor Stephen Nagy, Senior Associate Professor at International Christian University in Tokyo. He is also a Distinguished Fellow with Canada's Asia-Pacific Foundation and holds fellowship positions with the Canadian Global Affairs Institute and the Japan Institute for International Affairs. Professor Nagy also provides commentary for a wonderful Clubhouse room focusing on the Indo-Pacific. I highly recommend downloading the Clubhouse app and listening in. You will find it to be fascinating and you will learn a lot. The Clubhouse room is called Geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific in Japan's regional role. Professor Nagy, welcome. It's good to see you again.
It's good to see you again, Ted, and let's take a moment to think about all our friends in Ukraine and what's happening there, because it is really tragic, and I think that it'll have repercussions for not just the Ukrainian people, but for Europe, the United States, Canada, where I'm from, and this part of the world.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for saying that. To that point, how has the Indo-Pacific region responded to the war in Ukraine, and what has caught your eye?
So I think there's been leaders, there's been followers, and of course there's been parts of the region that have dithered in terms of the response about what's happened in Ukraine. In terms of leaders, I think Japan, Taiwan, Australia has been leaders in terms of putting forth sanctions on the Russian regime, speaking out and clearly articulating that this is an invasion of Ukraine, an invasion of a sovereign state, and that they are willing to walk the talk by putting sanctions on Russia, that it's going to affect their economies. They've called them out at the United Nations, and they're working with their partners to enforce sanctions at many different levels. The followers, I think that South Korea, to a certain extent, some Southeast Asian states have been followers, and they've moved their position, but they haven't really taken a strong response towards Russia. And then there's those countries that have dithered, and I think India is one of them. I think that Vietnam is one of them, as well as Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. And they have vested interests in not taking a strong position on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They import up to $2 billion of weapon parts, at least in the case of India, from Russia annually. The Vietnamese and others also have strong legacy relationships with the Russians, but also many of their arms come from Russia. So they're very hesitant about criticizing Russia explicitly and publicly. They're also concerned about what an explicit and overt criticism of Russia would mean in terms of their bilateral relations with China. Would these be interpreted as also a criticism against Chinese assertive behavior in the South China Sea, East China Sea, and across the Taiwan Straits? So again, followers, leaders, and dithers really, I think, characterize what we see in the Indo-Pacific region in terms of interpreting the invasion of Ukraine.
Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe called for the Japanese government to consider hosting US nuclear weapons. Who in the Japanese government supports Mr. Abe's idea and who opposes it?
This is a complex discussion, but Prime Minister Kishida, in his press briefing just last night and the night before, said explicitly, as somebody that comes from Hiroshima, where the first atomic bomb was dropped, and as a Prime Minister of Japan, and someone that respects the three no's. That's no to developing nuclear weapons, no to hosting nuclear weapons, and no to having them pass through Japanese waters. I think he represents the mainstream view about Japan possessing or hosting nuclear weapons. This is not a popular view in Japan. I understand Prime Minister Abe's strategic calculus behind this. I think that one of the take-home lessons for many countries within this region in terms of thinking about security and the challenges associated with China is that deterrence is incredibly important. Without a strong deterrent capability, they see a Russian-style invasion or forced reunification with Chinese characteristics is something that's quite feasible in this region, and that's it's very difficult for countries to push back unless they have a significant deterrence capability. And I think Prime Minister Abe's view is the strongest and the most important deterrence would be a strategic nuclear deterrence. But again, I think this is not popular within the party. It's not popular within the people, but it's an important discussion to have to push Japan's deterrence capabilities in a more positive and I think impactful direction.
Mm. How else has Russia's invasion of Ukraine affected the political debate in Japan?
Well, Japan, when discussing the free and open Indo-Pacific, one of the key principles is this idea of a rules-based order, is that countries follow rules, international law. And it's clear that Russia has violated international law by invading a sovereign state. Arguably, we're going to probably see calls for war crimes against Vladimir Putin and his ruling elite moving forward, especially after we saw the collateral damage against the nuclear power plant in Ukraine. So I think that within Japan itself, this is strengthened the argument for reinforcing a rules-based order, not only in the Indo-Pacific, but globally. And in order to do that, that means Japan has to stand up. It has to stand up in terms of supporting hard sanctions that will hurt the Japanese economy. It will have to sacrifice some of its interests. And you've seen even former Prime Minister Abe step away from the Northern Territories and step away from Vladimir Putin with the realization that their broader interests are about Japanese sovereignty and this rule-based order in the Indo-Pacific. And they'll probably have to give up the Northern Territories discussion until a new leader comes into Russia. I think there's also a shift in how the Japanese are thinking about what tools are going to be needed to deter future Russias in the backyard of where Japan lives. And that's financial instruments, using the SWIFT banking system to cut off funds, thinking about how to penalize or to squeeze very, very wealthy stakeholders that support different regimes, cutting off technology flows, and rethinking energy flows as well. So I think that Japan's energy security will be one of the key areas that it will also be thinking about. Where will it procure its energy resources? Will those be secure? And here I think that Japan will work more closely with the United States, Canada, and other countries that really are stable, like-minded countries that can provide those key energy resources. Lastly, I think that Japan is also thinking about, again, this diversification, and it's a selective diversification of supply chains. And that's in particular in the area of technology, but also in other areas to ensure that supply chains and trade cannot be weaponized, or the use of monopolies, as we saw in 2010 with the rare earth monopoly that China held, cannot be used as a weapon against Japan and other countries. So it's a real game changer. It's a critical juncture in terms of how Japan is thinking about many issues within its backyard, but also how to thread that needle of the economic benefits from their partnership with China and the real security challenges that are emerging out of China.
Speaking of China, China has so far refused to condemn Russia outright or describe its actions as an invasion. While China has presented itself as a defender of sovereign independence, its reluctance to denounce Russia's aggression forces it into an awkward position. Professor Nagy, what is your read on this, and what are your sources telling you about how the CCP views Russia's invasion? And as the war continues, what are your predictions as far as China's behavior going forward?
Well, frankly, this puts the Chinese government in a terribly awkward position. China has abided by what's called the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence for decades. It's the basis for its foreign policy. And I think the most important ones is respect for sovereignty and a rejection of the use of force to solve international disputes. China has also talked about the United Nations as being the key institution to deal with international disputes. Russia has violated all of these. And the fact that China has taken what they call as a pro-Russia neutrality really has placed the leadership in a position where they're being hypocrites in terms of their own founding foreign policy principles. So they're trying to balance their long-standing partnership with Russia with the reality that the international community, by and large, 160 countries voted for sanctions against Russia at the United Nations General Assembly. China abstained, India abstained, other friends, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh also abstained. These are very strong, there's a strong sense of cohesion and a shared view that what's happened in Russia is not good. But China does not want to alienate Russia. They view Russia as a critical partner in dealing with their strategic competition with regards to the United States. I think in the short to midterm that the Chinese will shift their position. They're already shifting it in terms of trying to develop some soft power by offering their good services to be a middleman in terms of negotiating between the Russians and the Ukrainians, because they have strong relations with both countries. I don't see this going anywhere. Again, I think countries see the Chinese government, rightly or wrongly, as facilitating this invasion, or at least tactically allowing it to happen. But I think what this will likely do is accelerate the dependency of Russia on the Chinese market, and that the Chinese will probably, in a predatory way, take advantage of Russia's weakened position vis-a-vis Europe and vis-a-vis the United States. And this likely will mean negotiating very cheap energy imports into China, probably other natural resources to ensure that the Chinese economy continues to grow. In the mid to long term, I think that the experience of Russia and the enormous amount of pressure that's being placed on Russia will be a learning lesson for China of how to harden their economy against similar sanctions and similar tactics to be used against China in the future if there is some kind of conflict. That means hardening their financial system, accelerating the digitization of the yuan, especially along the BRI countries, developing their own technologies in the semiconductor field and other fields, and really decoupling from the United States in areas that are sensitive to national security. They will also have to rethink many other issues within the region. One of the take-home lessons for many countries within this region is really, if they want to maintain their sovereignty and prevent a Russian-style invasion with Chinese characteristics in this region, is they're going to have to enhance their deterrence. Using a Canadian expression, they're going to have a porcupine approach to defense. And that means making it very, very, very difficult for the Chinese not only to invade, but to hold territories, whether it's the Senkaku Islands, whether it's Taiwan, or whether it's the South China Sea. So I think the Chinese really, again, are frustrated with what the Russians have done, but they can't change that. So they're turning towards how they can leverage the situation to better position China vis-a-vis Russia, and to use this as a learning experience to bolster their position within the region, harden their economy against similar tools being used against the Chinese. And they're probably stepping back from a more aggressive approach to thinking about how they want to reunify with Taiwan, understanding that if Russia can't do it, the Chinese are going to have a hell of a time in a forced reunification of Taiwan.
We recently saw the Beijing Winter Olympics conclude. Did the Olympic Games in Beijing in any way change the world's perceptions of China? As you are based in Asia, Professor Nagy, what have you heard about the reaction of China's Asian neighbors to the Beijing Winter Olympics?
Well, like with most things with China, it's very difficult to put one label. So I think that countries like Pakistan, Nepal, some South Central Asian countries, Russian athletes, they all look at the Olympics as being successful. There was I don't think there was any known cases of COVID-19 spreading outside the bubble, that the event was exceptionally well organized, that the Chinese people that were allowed to watch were extremely friendly. And the sporting events were in general, they're great sports. So I think that many countries would feel this way. And I think even Japanese athletes, South Korean athletes, Australian athletes, Canadian athletes felt that, that the Olympics were great. But for Western countries and some non-Western countries, they have looked at the Winter Olympics through the lens of the Uyghur re-education camps, about what's happened in Hong Kong, through the lens of wolf warrior diplomacy. This has colored how they view the Olympics. I think also, the fact that this has happened during the COVID-19 pandemic has made it really a no-win situation for the Chinese in terms of developing soft power to countries that they would like to shift their position, in that they had to really prevent the engagement of ordinary Chinese with athletes. And that's what normally happens with the Olympic events. I participated in the 1992 Winter Olympics in Albertville on the National Disabled Ski Team. And I got to spend time with French families and eat French food and engage in the community. And that's where you really develop that soft power. And I think the fact that, whether the Canadians, Americans, Australians didn't get to do that with ordinary Chinese really means that the Olympics, they look great, they're shiny, but they didn't get to have that grassroots people-to-people exchanges that really accrue soft power and a better feeling about the country. So we have to really be realistic that mixed results, lots of great things to say about the organization, but not so much about the soft power that could have been accrued in a different situation.
Earlier, you had mentioned Taiwan, and I wanted to follow up. Taiwan's government condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine, accusing it of changing the status quo and pledging to take appropriate actions in coordination with the US and other like-minded partners. Have you heard anything about Taiwan's reaction to the Ukraine invasion in other ways? And can Taiwan learn anything from Ukraine's experience?
So I think that Taiwan understands the incredible importance of deterrence to ensure that the United States and other partners of Taiwan can come to Taiwan's aid if there was a forced reunification of Taiwan with the mainland. So that goes back to my porcupine comments. That means making it really, really difficult for the Chinese to take Taiwan, to hold Taiwan, and to be able to push back friends and partners of Taiwan who would inevitably come to Taiwan's aid if the invasion was pushed by mainland China. And I think that's an important lesson that the Taiwanese have taken home. The Japanese have also, strengthened their position, because they are very concerned that this would that China could push reunification through force, and this would affect sea lines of communication throughout the region, and of course, Japanese economic security. Taiwan has also taken home the lesson that it needs to strengthen its how it's embedded in international organizations and international partnerships. And as you know, after the People's Republic of China became the representative of China in the United Nations, only 7 or 8 countries recognize Taiwan as a sovereign state, which means that it's almost impossible for Taiwan to join international organizations unless China says it's okay. So in this standpoint, Taiwan is trying to rethink how they can embed themselves in international organizations and multilateral frameworks so that what happens in Taiwan matters to other countries. And we see the, trying to accelerate its negotiations to enter the TPP-11, Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, trying to enter the World Health Organization, and trying to find other multilateral forums that it can join, will be an important lesson moving forward. The Baltic states were not invaded by Russia. It was Ukraine who was not part of NATO, not part of the European Union. And Russia understood this, and the Ukraine now is rushing to join these international organizations because they view if they're part of these international organizations, there'll be more incentive for other countries to come and help Ukraine. So I think those are really important lessons. Lastly, I think that it's only enhanced the importance of Taiwanese politicians of not being provocative in terms of their statements about China. That means adhering to the status quo, not really talking about independence, talking about strengthening the status quo between China and Taiwan. This is a very nuanced position, but it's a position that Japan, the United States, Australia, Canada, and other countries also support. Back in December, former Prime Minister Abe said that a Taiwanese contingency is a Japanese contingency. He wasn't supporting Taiwanese independence. He was supporting the status quo. And various statements by the Japanese government, the United States government, and others really are supporting the status quo. And they're trying to send that message to both Beijing and Taiwan that we will not support Taiwanese independence, but we will certainly not support a forced reunification with Taiwan. And I think Taiwanese politicians understand that.
North Korean leader Kim Jong-un recently stated that the United States is the root cause of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Professor Nagy, how do you read this? Is Kim Jong-un trying to get attention from the Biden administration, or is he trying to in some way ingratiate himself with Putin? Perhaps something else?
So this is a good question, Ted. So this narrative is similar to the Russians, to the Chinese, and of course now the North Koreans, in that they view that alliance structures in their backyards is fundamentally threatening the security of, in the case of Russia, China, and North Korea. North Korea has consistently said that they will give up their nuclear weapons in exchange for the United States leaving the region. And that means not only leaving the peninsula, but it means leaving Japan, leaving Guam, leaving Saipan, and giving up its alliances within the region. Of course, this isn't going to happen, but it's a consistent message that the Chinese have also said, that the Chinese are threatened by the United States, various alliances and security pacts and strategic partnerships within the Indo-Pacific, because they feel this is surrounding China with an American architecture, a security architecture that threatens and targets and is meant to contain China. The Russians as well, they use this particular argument that the United States and EU expanded the NATO framework 5 times since the end of the Cold War into Russia's sphere of influence. And from their viewpoint, it's the United States and the encouragement of the expansion of the NATO and the reliance on alliances that has threatened the security of Russia. So we see a common arc or a common theme of these authoritarian leaders is that they see the United States alliances and partnerships and these multilateral institutions like NATO as being threatening to the security of North Korea, China, and Russia. In my view, I don't think NATO is a military threat to Russia. And I don't think the United States is a military threat to North Korea or China, but the establishment of functioning, liberal democratic, rule of law based countries in the backyard of North Korea or China or Russia represents contradiction and a threat to those regimes. As we know, Mr. Putin has been in power since 2000 when he took over from President Yeltsin. Remember Y2K, right? We thought the world was going to end, and it didn't end. Mr. Yeltsin gave power to, a relative unknown, Vladimir Putin, and he's been in power for now 21 years. And it's an authoritarian state. It's in a state that doesn't provide economic prosperity to its citizens. And it's a state without rule of law. They've killed people with plutonium overseas. Now they've invaded a sovereign state. If Ukraine somehow survives this, and it does become a functioning liberal democratic society, this is a challenge to authoritarian Russia. And I think in a similar way, the South Korea, as a functioning liberal democratic society supported by the United States, is an ideological threat for North Korea. And this is something that is, again, it's a similar understanding of all these three states, because they're authoritarian states. They're threatened less by military power, but more about, I think, ideological systems.
Shifting back to Japan, in July of this year, the House of Councilors, or the upper house, will hold elections. And it will be held to elect 124 of the 245 members in that chamber. It's awfully early yet, but what do you see as being some of the issues that we think will be of focus for the campaigns?
So I think first and foremost, the current Prime Minister Kishida, has advocated something called New Capitalism, and trying to rectify some of the challenges that have emerged because of the COVID-19 pandemic. There's been real winners and losers in terms of, in terms of economics because of the pandemic. If you had Wi-Fi, you could work from home. This is, your life has probably improved. If you didn't, it's been tough, real tough. So I think that COVID-19 gaps in social economic development is going to be an issue. Second is trying to address some of the inequality issues that have emerged from Abenomics. And here, I think that this is a more nuanced discussion, because Abenomics has clearly benefited Japan. The GDP has gone up. We see corporate profits up. We see unemployment up, employment has, is quite high. We've seen Abenomics focus on the inclusion of women. It's an imperfect process, as all policies are, but in general, Japan has benefited under Abenomics. But there are parts of society that haven't. And this is where I think new capitalism under the Kishida administration will probably be an important area. What exactly is new capitalism? I think this is being debated, but trying to promote more inclusion into Japanese society, increase wages, to create institutions such as nursery care, kindergarten for families, to create an infrastructure to allow women and men to be in the workforce. And you're probably saying, what is different about new capitalism compared to all the other initiatives, whether it's the Angel Plan in the 1980s or otherwise? And the reality is that these problems have been with Japan since the 1980s. And they continue to be with Japan. And it's partly related to, it's a very engendered society where men and women they function in separate worlds. Family life is primarily the responsibility of women, where men, the primary responsibility is to work. And they're trying to negotiate and find a new balance. And this is very, very difficult to solve. And again, it's been with us since the 1980s. Whether new capitalism can deal with this or not is a real question. I think that also Prime Minister Kishida is going to try and discuss the importance of digitization and digitizing the economy to make it more efficient, more productive, and increase the productivity of the average worker so that there's more people can have more time at home, but also increase their salary. And I think this is something that's really, really, really important and will be a focus. And it's a challenge. I always use the example, I have the unfortunate experience of usually visiting the Apple store before I visit the local ward office. And if you go to the Apple store, everything's digitized. You sign your name. They know all your information. Everything's done in about 5 minutes. It's amazing service.
Yeah.
If you go to the ward office, and I know all the ward workers work really hard, I have to sign physical papers and everything is very slow. And this is real representative of the gap in Japan that needs to be bridged through things like new economics. I think the opposition parties are going to continue to focus on military spending or defense spending. They're going to, which is a losing argument, frankly. They're going to talk about increasing welfare payments for the poor parts of Japanese society. They're going to talk about free education at the graduate level and undergraduate level. But the question is where does this money come from? Japan is already hugely indebted domestically. So I think that these arguments, while important, really are not realistic. What is realistic is incremental change and increasing productivity through digitization and finding new ways to build capital in Japan and dealing with the reality that the structural forces such as demographic issues in Japan are really have a downward pressure on the Japanese economy, and they need to find creative solutions to create more capital and bring back that capital to Japan and invest it in social welfare systems, healthcare, pensions, and education.
Do you know if Prime Minister Kishida's new capitalism addresses the increasing gap in fortunes between full-time salaried workers and temporary workers in Japan?
The reality is that this trend is global. Japan is about 40 years sometimes in terms of how we think about employment. If you go back to the United States in the 1970s, this is where we see women coming into the workforce. They first work part-time, and then gradually men lose their permanent employment and they go into contractual employments. So we're seeing similar trends in Japan, just a lot later. The view in Japan is that there should be one permanent income, and that's usually the man who's prioritized. Women's income is a plus alpha. So if they get a part-time job, that's great. And there's tax incentives for women to stay at home and have a part-time job. So I think the figure was 1.5 million yen. So that's about 15,000 US dollars a year would be tax-free. So they've tried to create an inducement where women can work, but they're also can stay at home. But this doesn't work anymore. The new economics, the new capitalism is going to have to address the reality that you need two incomes to live in Tokyo or in Osaka or Kyoto, that you need to find ways to ensure that men can be home and be part of the household, that women can be home and part of the household. You need to find new ways to increase the gap between those better off families and the less better off families. And there's a need for employment flexibility. And this speaks to your point about temporary workers versus full-time workers. Japan has almost no horizontal mobility for full-time workers. So if I was wanting to switch to another university, it's very, very difficult. Not because I'm not qualified, just the system is not set up for horizontal transfer within employment. And that's businesses as well. So this is an area that I think the government needs to address. Same with vertical mobility. So no matter how hard you work, it's about time in the job rather than what you produce in the job. And again, this creates challenges in terms of how families and workers make decisions about employment. So if you have no horizontal or vertical mobility within the employment sector, then you choose stability. In temporary work, there needs to be a potential for not only horizontal mobility within the temporary sector, but also vertical mobility as well as the ability to transfer from temporary worker to full-time worker. And again, the government has tried to address this by basically saying if you've hired somebody for 3 years, that you have to make them a permanent worker. The question is, how do you create more incentives for businesses to adopt permanent workers in the context of Japan? And I don't think they've found the correct formula yet. And there is even a bigger question. Is this the right way to address the employment issues in Japan? Should all work be not permanent and rather create more opportunity for horizontal and vertical mobility and performance-based pay? So I'm not saying a 100% transition to this kind of employment sector would fix some of the challenges in Japan, but I think that there needs to be a discussion about, what is the best combination of these two systems to address the employment issues that you mentioned, but also create opportunity for innovative young Japanese people or older Japanese people so that they can, become the billionaires or the millionaires and go to space like the recent Japanese internet mogul. And there's not a lot of opportunities for that. And I think it's something that needs to be addressed.
Professor Nagy, what is the state of the COVID pandemic in Japan now? And what is the Japanese public's view about the government's handling of COVID?
So I think yesterday there was about 8,000 or 9,000 cases in Tokyo. So that is a city of about 35 million people. So it continues to drop. And I think ordinary Japanese people have said, well, we're tired of COVID. Omicron seems to be not so serious. Let's get on with our life. That seems to be the general impression. If you go out for lunch in downtown Tokyo, the restaurants are full. But they've adopted, a lot of different technologies and strategies to prevent the spread of COVID. So I think that's one part of the COVID situation here. Second, the borders are relatively closed. So we don't have the import of Omicron or other variants into Japan. And this is extremely popular. And it continues to be extremely popular amongst the ordinary Tanaka or Suzuki. But for the business community, this is a big problem. They want to bring in, business leaders to come in and, do business. For universities like my own, we want to bring in the overseas students. They're an important part of our internationalization strategy. For the Japanese government, they want to bring in all those students that are sponsored by the Japanese government because they're important for internationalization of the education system, for building Japanese soft power, and again, for Japanese people to be able to find out what other cultures are about. So I think that this is another area that is really, the COVID pandemic policies have been really problematic. And, many of the service sector jobs and manufacturing jobs that depend on non-skilled and low-skilled workers, they just can't get back into the country. So it's not good for the Toyotas and Hondas and Suzukis and other large and small and medium-sized industries that depend on migrant workers. But it's still popular. And I expect that the migration into Japan will not increase significantly over the next year. The Japanese have committed to about 7,000 people coming into the country a day. That doesn't include residents like myself. It would be people like you who don't have a residency permit. So that will remain limited until they can fill all the backlog of people that actually have permission to come here for work or for studies. Post-election, I expect the borders to become much more porous, but I don't expect Japan to return to the 20 million tourists a year in Japan ever again. Wow. My view is that they're going to fundamentally change their strategy about tourism. They're going to decrease the numbers and increase the number of people that are spending a lot more money. I think that they'll make it more difficult for some countries to come to Japan, and there'll be other countries that will be facilitated. And this is partly related to the burden that tourism put on communities like Kyoto or Tokyo, but also a sense that there are challenges, geopolitical challenges that are going to make open borders more problematic. So I don't expect Japan returning to the tourism economics that were characterized most of 2010 to 2000 or pre-pandemic.
Yeah,
which should be really interesting to see. It'll make Kyoto much nicer to visit.
Yes, it got really crowded the past decade. Yeah. What percentage of the Japanese population has been able to get a COVID booster shot?
Well, I think it's much easier to get than the people that are actually getting it. And the reason is that the facilities are everywhere. They've amplified their capability to get the booster shot out, but in reality, people work. And let me just give you an example. The place where I get this great haircut that I have, those barbers, they work from 8 in the morning until 8 at night. And the centers where you can get the booster shot, of course, don't work are not open during the time that they have to go home. So there's a lot of workers like that. And it goes back to that point I mentioned about the inequality associated with COVID-19, where those people that can work from home, like me, I can go and get my booster really easily. But those people that are in a service sector that have to be in the job to get their wage, it's really difficult. So we see the booster numbers going up, especially for the elderly. For the service sector, the booster numbers are quite low. For second shots, it's quite high. So I think we see a big variation, and that variation is based on the kind of job that you have. And if you're a temporary worker, very, very difficult to get the booster because you have to work to earn your keep. So these are areas that I think, again, new capitalism was going to need to address when they're thinking about not only in terms of salary and permanent employment, but how temporary employment in service sector really prejudices many from taking the opportunity that horizontal and vertical mobility can come if they can pick up other skills or do other, get their booster, or do other things. So this is all interrelated. It's not an isolated issue. The inequality that's in society is seen where you get booster shots, if you can get other licenses, and all of this is related to how much employment flexibility and choice you have.
So we're now in March. This time of year, typically the plum blossoms are delightful. Are they in bloom yet?
Yeah, there's some great blossoms just near my house in the park. The plum blossoms are out and they'll continue to blossom this week. They're a rich, deep fuchsia color, and they're spectacular. They usher in spring. They're the first sign that the winter is going. And of course, they're a sign that the cherry blossoms are coming.
Right. So my next question, what is the forecast for this year's cherry blossoms? Do we know when they'll be blooming?
Well, in the Tokyo area, it looks like they're going to bloom between March 20th and March 27th. But if you go to southern Japan, that's the cherry blossoms, the sakura, they blossom a little bit earlier because it's warmer there. And of course, northern Japan, whether it's Tohoku or Hokkaido, they'll blossom later. So if you have time and the money, the best thing to do is to go to Kyoto first and then come up to Tokyo and then go up to the Tohoku region and Hokkaido, and you can see the wave of cherry blossoms spreading out through Japan. You can try all the regional food and see how, this is a universal joy for, I think, almost all Japanese, is seeing the cherry blossoms and having a bento box with a cold beer and some seasonal seafood with family and friends. I hope I can do that in the future.
Fantastic. So are the authorities this year going to allow for the large cherry blossom viewing gatherings? Are those COVID restrictions being pared back?
So at this stage, I think that the government has encouraged people to continue to have self-restraint. But at the same time, the Japanese people have been quite disciplined in wearing masks, having alcohol to wash their hands, and engaging in social distance. So even now, if you walk through the parks during the day, you'll see groups of mothers under the plum blossom tree or nearby, but they have social distancing. They're wearing their masks and washing their hands. So I think that they'll be somewhat more permissive in terms of preventing or allowing people to gather But those social codes to prevent the spread of COVID seem to have already been deeply embedded in terms of the behavior of people. So I assume that they'll allow some gathering, but they'll encourage social distancing this year and probably next year as well.
Well, it sounds like things are heading in a better direction. So that's good news.
Yeah, definitely. I think that COVID seems to be, people are learning how to coexist with COVID. And that's what's really, really critical. The fear behind COVID is not there. But on a negative note, I think COVID in many ways is associated with coming from the outside. And that means coming from foreigners. And this is a challenge in terms of creating, more coexistence with foreigners and Japanese in Japan, and creating that awareness that this is a disease. It's not a foreigner disease or a Japanese disease. It's a disease that affects everybody equally.
Well, Professor Nagy, thank you so much for your analysis. It's always great to see you. Please keep well, and we look forward to checking in with you soon.
Thanks, Ted. It's a great pleasure. And again, let's have one more thought for those people of Ukraine. Understand how Ukraine fits in not only Ukraine's future, but the importance of supporting their sovereignty and their human rights, and pushing back against authoritarian states that really are trying to reshape the world in their image, rather than reshape the world in the image of citizens from free societies.
Here, absolutely, 100%. Thank you, sir.
Look forward to next time. Thanks, Ted.
Thanks.